Let's see now. Okay. Okay, are we all ready to go? Ready? Ready? Aliana, you ready? Math homework? Almost done? Okay. So, just so you know, you'll see my face up here, which might seem kind of odd, but I upgraded my streaming software, so now I can, what I'm streaming you can see on here, and that way I can see everything I need to see here. So I just needed to upgrade, but now I can do everything I need to do. At least I hope so. Okay, here we go. All right, so good morning. This is probably really weird. Don't look up there. So good morning, welcome to history again. I'm just gonna say good morning to our online people and see who's here. And actually, now I realize that I forgot to say hello on Teams, so I'm gonna do that as well. And we'll see who's tuned in. Ananda's here. Good morning, Ananda. Yeah, because I can do this too. So now I can show you guys. What comes up as well. So Ananda's here. Good morning, Ananda. And Shania's here. Good morning to you. See, isn't this much better? And who else? This is Michaela. Michaela's there. Good morning, Michaela. Yeah, much better. So you will recall yesterday. The question is, will I recall yesterday what we were doing? So I'm going to go to the slides, and that should refresh our memory, I hope. Oops, that'll refresh our memory. It might be. I think maybe I'll have the IT guys come in a little bit later. I think I'd like it to be a bit bigger as well, like the screen could be bigger, so I'll fix that. Ayushi's here too. Good morning, Ayushi. Okay. So yesterday we were talking about the British home front, what happens for not just British people, but people in Western Europe in general while World War I is going on. And so we said that because the war effort was so massive, it very quickly became apparent to the British government and to other European governments as well that they were going to need to step in. They were going to need to control the economy. They were going to need to organize people's efforts in order to win this war. Because like we read about yesterday, this war was about, yes, it was about strategy, and yes, it was about taking land and all of the normal war stuff that wars are about, but it was also about resources, right? And how it was looking, good morning, how it was starting to look was that the country with the most resources and the country that could throw the most resources and men and weapons at the war was going to be the country that won, right? And so it wasn't so much about military strategy, although it was, and it wasn't so much about technology, but it also was. It was really just about who could produce more. And so to that end, lots of countries started to organize their economies, excuse me, take control of their workforce in order to make sure that they could produce as much as they possibly could, because that was the ticket to winning, right? And we said that was called total war. And so we said they organized people's working and leisure hours. We said that in some cases later on in the war, they rationed people so you could only buy so much of certain things. And as a result, we saw that women were entering the workforce. We saw that some households were able to earn more money and buy luxury goods. And we also found that people were finding ways to let off a bit of steam, right? Because wartime is tense, right? Even if you're not at the front fighting, war is a tense time. People aren't sure what's going to happen. People's kind of, come on in, hello. People's regular lives are kind of turned upside down. We said that sometimes social rules and restrictions are loosened or kind of ignored, and people tend to they need ways to relax, right? They need ways to relieve the tension. And so we see people going to Hollywood movies really for the first time. We see people going to dance halls and drinking and having a good time because you need to do that, right? You need to let loose a little bit when there's a war on, right? Yeah, and we also said that, so this changed British society by empowering women and putting them into the workforce in a way that they'd never been before. Again, when the war was over, some women would kind of revert back to their domestic sphere, but many women didn't, right? Many women weren't interested in going back to just the home and the family. They were interested in having jobs, right? And having autonomy and more freedom, which is not to say that men welcomed that necessarily, but yeah, women gained a certain amount of power in this period. We saw some poor families, morning Mike, some poor families were able to earn more and increase their standard of living, and in some countries, women actually gained the right to vote in this period of history as well, although I pointed out it was really only some women at the beginning, right? So here in Canada, it was only women who were related to someone or connected to someone who was fighting in the war, and then it was extended to all women, but really all white women is what the vote was extended to, and women of color had to wait sometimes decades longer in order to be able to vote. And so we watched a little video yesterday. We talked about a few things, and we said that even though a lot of things were changing for women and wartime was a crazy time where social rules were changing, to some degree traditional gender roles still applied, right? There were women in the military, but that didn't mean that women could do exactly the same jobs as, or were allowed to do the same jobs as men were, right? And so they were most often nurses, sometimes they were in the signal corps, they were doing administrative work, and so they were participating in the military, but they didn't do quote unquote man jobs, right? Because we still had a pretty clear gender division at this time in history, right? Just occurred to me that I didn't finish typing that slide. Remind me then, how did gender roles change? Remind me of that. What's that? Yeah, so women were working in heavy industry and factory doing manual labor, which in the past women didn't really do, right?
A very small portion of women were joining army, like war.
Right, we did hear about very few women who actually managed to find their way into the Army Corps and actually fought in the war, right? Really only a handful, but some did, right, which is pretty impressive.
They were earning.
Huh?
They were earning.
They were earning?
Yeah.
Yeah. So they were earning money like they hadn't before. Ghazi is here as well. I should put that up there. Good morning to you. I hope I pronounced your name right. I'm sorry if I didn't. I think this is Kevin. Good morning, Kevin. And Ayushi says women became more independent, right? So that was important as well, right? If you have your own job and you have your own money, you have a degree of independence, right? You have more freedom than if you have a husband or a father that is providing everything for you, right? That's very true. Sorry, Shafan, what did you say before?
Women were war and earning.
Oh, about, and yeah, okay, good. So, okay, we've got all that.
They were fighting for the right to vote.
Yeah, they fought for the right to vote, and that was a change to traditional gender roles as well, right? So that was women entering really the political sphere, and politics was another area of society that was formerly reserved just for men, right? So only men were in politics. Women were assumed to be too fragile and too emotional and, not capable of making the hard decisions that politics required, which of course is bananas, right? There's it's ridiculous. But of course, that's what people were thinking at the time. And so, but here we see women being able to enter politics, being able to vote, and in some cases being able to run for office. And so after this in Canada, we'll see women being elected to provincial governments and then to federal governments. Some women will be appointed judges after this. And so it's one step toward equality for women in Canada, even though we're still not there yet. We're a lot closer than they were in. What's that? Yeah, oh yeah. There was definitely racism. Lots of it. There still is, unfortunately, but for sure. Okay. So where we are here is that I guess we're partway through World War I. There's a section of the text here that I'd like you to read because it's going to lead us toward the end part of the war. And so I think in this part, it will discuss the entry of the U.S. into the war. And then after we kind of deal with that, then we can move to the end of the war and the things that happen toward the end, because how the war closes out and the agreement that all the countries come to is, of course, going to be very important in how the rest of the 20th century unfolds. And so that last year of the war, 1918, and the peace agreement that comes out of it is going to structure the way Europe works. To some degree, it's going to influence the global power structure. And again, that's going to set the stage really for the rest of the 20th century, okay? So maybe what I will do then is give you, can I give you 15 minutes to read that? Is that too much? Too little? Just right? Too little? Okay, let's start with 15 and see how it goes, okay? So the pages you need to read are in Microsoft Teams as usual. So that's your question, my friend. In Microsoft Teams, under Files, you'll find I've got a document in there that you can read. Yeah, so I'll let you read. I'll let you answer the questions, and I'll put a timer up here. I think. There we go. And then in 15 minutes, we'll talk about what we've read, okay? Okay, people, let's let's take a crack at some of these and see what we can come up with. So this section starts out with a little bit about Russia, right? And it explains how Russia is kind of suffering through the war, right? Like I mentioned, Russia is, at this point in history, it's a pretty poor country. They have a very small kind of nobility and sort of czarist family running the place. But basically everyone in Russia are kind of poor farmers. And so the Russians haven't really industrialized, not nearly to the same degree as Britain and France and Germany. And so they're kind of at a disadvantage. But what they do have, of course, is population, right? They have a huge amount of people. And so they can continually sort of put soldiers into the war and kind of hold their own. But it's at pretty significant personal cost to the Russians, right? Because again, the Russians aren't well equipped, they're not well trained, and so the Russians are just kind of being sacrificed to the machine of war by the Tsar. And so there's a lot of pressure within Russia to get them out of the war. They're suffering food shortages and famines and all kinds of things at the time. And they will have a revolution and they'll be pulled out of the war in 1917. But I don't want to talk too much about that now because I would like to look at the story of Russia kind of from beginning to end. So we'll deal with all of that Russian stuff in just a little bit. So I just want to set it aside for the moment. But I do want to talk about the US because we see that as the Russians leave the war, the Americans will enter. And so how does it come about that the Americans enter World War I? Huh? Both. How, why, when, who, where?
So first there was some naval warfare that kind of turned the U.S. public for the war, and then eventually it was again that's what the telegraph. That's what the Germans sent to their ambassador in the U.S. telling them that he should go to the Mexicans and tell them that we support your claim to, I think it was Texas, Arizona, and some other place.
Right.
If you attack the U.S. now to kind of grab the attention.
Right. So there's a. Sorry. Go ahead.
But the U.S. couldn't join the war immediately. Then it was like they declared war and everything, but they couldn't get into the war right away. They had to wait for another year to prepare. But then they worked as an arsenal, sending guns and tanks and basically everything.
Right. One of the things that we should kind of preface this conversation with is that the United States in 1917, let's say, it's not kind of the same United States that we know. Now, forgetting what's happening now with Donald Trump, because who knows what that's about, but prior to Donald Trump, we kind of know a different kind of America, right? We know the United States as kind of a global superpower, right? A global policeman, right? They have their nose in everyone's business, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. They've got a huge military that's all around the world. They're involved in peace deals in the Middle East, or at least trying to negotiate them. They're kind of everywhere, right? And they're used as kind of a global policeman. But that's not the America that exists in 1917. The America that exists in 1917 is much more isolationist. And so they're not really interested in global affairs. They're kind of doing their own thing. And when war breaks out in Europe, basically the American reaction is, well, that's their problem, right? That's a European war. We're not interested, right? And so for a long time they're not. But Ahmad, as you've pointed out, the public opinion starts to turn when German submarines are sinking American warships. Because, the Americans are trading with the Triple Entente, right? They're still trading with Britain, they're still trading with France, and both of those, they're indirectly supporting the war effort, right? And so German submarines start to sink American ships, and the Americans, understandably, are upset by that, right? But then, as you mentioned, and also as Ayushi mentions here, there's an ill-advised telegram, right? So Germany sends a little message to the Mexican government and says, "Psst, hey, if you want to attack the United States and try to take the southern states for your own, we'll support you," right? And so as the textbook points out, this is a pretty dumb and desperate move by the Germans, but they try it anyway. And unfortunately for Germany, maybe unfortunately for Mexico too, but unfortunately for Germany, the Americans intercept this message, right? And so the Americans find out that Germany is trying to get someone else to attack them out of nowhere. As you might imagine, the Americans don't like that one bit. And so, yeah, it ends with a declaration of war on the Triple Alliance, right? On Germany and Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Let's see, what's our next question here? That's Germany's war aims, right? Okay. Whoops. So, Germany's war aims. So this is when U.S. President Woodrow Wilson is, Woodrow Wilson is it weird?
No.
Have my face up there?
No, like looking at the cat.
Oh, the cat's there too. Yeah, the cat is. That's my cat. She's asking the question. So when the U.S. is going to become involved in the war, they ask both sides what their war aims are. Right? What is the purpose of your fighting? What are you trying to achieve? Right? And what's the response to that?
Germany wanted to reach economic self-sufficiency.
Right. Did I? Oh, yeah, okay. So Germany wanted to, sorry, there's a bug. Sorry, Aliana, say that one more time.
Germany wanted to reach economic self-sufficiency.
Yeah, Germany wanted to reach economic self-sufficiency. What's the special word they use for that? Because it'll come up again.
Position of autarky.
Autarky, yes, not a turkey, that's different, but autarky. So that's the fancy word they use for economic self-sufficiency. So Germany feels they don't have enough land, particularly farmland, to feed their people, and so they want to expand their borders and have overseas colonies in order to be economically self-sufficient. So they say, eventually they say that that's what they're trying to achieve, right? Yeah, autarky. And it's kind of funny and kind of tragic, actually, that when Woodrow Wilson asks this question, you know, the answer from the Triple Entente, so from Britain and France, the answer is, oh, we're trying to defeat the other people's armies, right? So why are you fighting? Well, we're fighting to win the war, right? For no other reason, right? They're fighting so that they can eventually stop fighting. And so the whole thing is ridiculous, you know, tragically ridiculous. But and then sort of after a little more thought, the Triple Entente comes up with a more convincing set of war aims, which you read, right? So trying to restore get Germany to respect its original borders, to redraw the map of Europe along nationalistic lines. All of these things they come up with later, but of course it's almost like Woodrow Wilson's request makes them think about, what are we actually trying to do here? Which again is ridiculous, but also quite tragic, right? What are Wilson's war aims? So this is U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. I know he's got a bunch, but let's.
Germany to withdraw from all occupied territories.
Right, so anything that Germany has sort of conquered or taken over in the context of World War I, Woodrow Wilson would like them to give it back, right? Don't take other people's stuff, Germany. What else?
Minority self-determination.
Right. So he wanted to give ethnic and mostly ethnic minorities the ability to self-determine. What does self-determination mean?
Choose which one you use.
Basically, yeah. Self-determination is to choose what you want to do, right? To be in control of your own choices or your own affairs.
One thing, before the war broke out, Poland was a German state, right? Like they were under Germany's rule.
I think partly German and partly Russia, maybe. I'm not sure where the dividing line was, but probably mostly Germany.
So the country was like, was part of Germany, and then one of Wilson's war aims was that, okay, we want you to give that away.
There's probably, the Poles are kind of a separate ethnic group. And so you'd probably have to go back into, the 17 and 1800s to determine how Germany came to be in possession of Poland in the first place. That history I don't know. But it does, I think that idea does fit with, the idea of redrawing Europe along nationalistic lines, right? So yes, it's under the control of Germany, and yes, they were asked to give it up, but they were asked to give it up so that, this large group of Poles could have a country of their own. But the history prior to that, I'm not sure about in terms of how the Poles kind of found themselves under the control of Germany to begin with.
The British kind of, it was a few years before that, the British went into war with the colonies in America because they wanted to rule themselves.
Yeah.
And now they're asking.
Yeah. Well, different. That was a couple hundred years before, so maybe they changed their mind. Rafin. Okay, so Rafin says, Rafin says that Wilson wanted open diplomacy, right? So he said the way Woodrow Wilson saw it, a lot of the problems of World War I were caused by these kind of secret alliances, right? And the fact that nobody was talking to one another, right? And so everyone became suspicious of everyone else. Everyone became unsure of what what the country next door to them was going to do. Everyone became a little paranoid. And so Woodrow Wilson is saying, hey, no more secret alliances, no more, backroom, closed door deals. Let's have open diplomacy. Let's get this stuff out in the open. Sort of. And that's going to be that's one of Wilson's war aims as well, right? Is that number 14? Which one is it? It's in his list there. I don't know if you, here it is. Yeah, what's number 14 say there?
The formation of a general association of nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike. All states must undertake to deal collectively with any threat to peace whenever it occurs. Right.
So that's right there. That's Woodrow Wilson's template for the United Nations, right? Is a general association of nations that ensure collective security and deal with any threat to peace as a group, right? So that's his blueprint. And so he'll, spoiler alert, but out of that, he will manage to create a League of Nations. And so it'll be the forerunner to the United Nations. Spoiler alert again, it won't work out very well, the League of Nations, but we'll get to that. But that's Woodrow Wilson's idea. It comes up in his 14 points, and he's going to get it inserted into the peace treaty once they negotiate it. So that's one of the things he wants too. That's one of his war aims, is to create this, group of nations that work together to ensure everyone's collective security. Um, so open diplomacy, so no more secret alliances, no more secret deals. Everybody talks to everyone else in the open, and this association of states, which will become the will become the League of Nations. So there was this idea to defeat others' armies, and so that was what the Triple Entente originally said, because they probably hadn't thought too far about what they were trying to do. They were just trying to win the war. So that definitely came up. What other things does Wilson suggest?
Freedom of the seas and open
Freedom of the seas and open trade,
trade.
right? So this idea of, we've probably heard of international waters before, right? So international waters are most of the ocean where, nobody really has dominion over it. And so it allows people to freely ship things around the globe, right? Which of course is critically important for the world we live in today, but Wilson also wanted that in the past, right? Michaela says here, he wanted people to have freedom of open sea. Okay, so countries would engage in open world trade. That's good, good, good. What else? He's got a whole bunch of them. He wanted to establish a Polish state, right? He wanted to redraw the boundaries of Europe along nationalistic lines. Open diplomacy, freedom of the seas.
Disarmament and establishment of an association of nations for the purpose of collective security.
Right, so that's the League of Nations idea there, but also disarmament, right? He's saying that countries should act or should work to limit their military and their stores of weapons, not keep building and building and building, because of course weapons that are built tend to get used, right? So the more weapons a country has, the more danger there is that they will actually use them. Let's see, anything else? I know he's got a bunch. Those are probably the main ones. I'm just going to scan through them. I know there's some smaller ones too. Yeah, I think those are his main ones. There's some smaller ones, but we don't need to pay too much attention to every single one of them. Let's see. Oh, and the last one. Okay. What's the primary contribution of the U.S. to the war effort? Food? It's true. The U.S. has probably been supplying food to the Triple Entente for some time, because America at the time was a massive producer of wheat, and places like Britain, maybe less so France, but definitely Britain would have imported a lot of food because they're an island and they don't have much in the way of agricultural land. And so definitely food would have come in, but what else? What else were they providing?
Manpower.
They'll provide manpower a little bit later. Yeah, and armament, right? Guns, tanks, bombs, things like that. So, what's that? So, eventually, yeah, and eventually they will. Later on, they will. So, when the U.S. first declares war, they're not quite ready to go to war yet, and so most of their involvement will just be providing resources to Triple Entente. Later, they'll send soldiers, but actually, if I remember correctly, very few American soldiers will actually fight in World War I because they kind of get there at the tail end. Most of the fighting is over, and so some American soldiers see some combat, but not that many. Hadia, did you want to say something? No? You're good? Okay. So yeah, they do provide soldiers eventually, but initially it's resources. And again, remember, this is a war of resources, right? This is not so much about strategy or technology, although to some degree it is. It's really more about who can produce more and who can keep producing and keep contributing resources to the war to win it, right? Okay. That is good. Do you want to take a little break? I know it might be a little bit early, but Amanda, what do you think?
Yeah.
Break time?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back, and I think we'll talk about the Treaty of Versailles, if I remember. But take a break, and we'll see you in just a little bit. All right. So we're back on the big screen. Right. So everybody with me? Eyes, eyes, eyes. Mike, you with me back there? Yeah? Okay. So as we can see, the Russians leave the war, but the Americans will enter into it, right? And so they'll enter into it because, of course, the Germans are sinking their ships that are just trying to, maybe not so innocently, but innocently trade with the British and the French. And then there's that telegram trying to get Mexico to attack the US, right? The Germans send this telegram. The Americans are none too happy with it. And so as a result, they get themselves involved in the war. And so they ask the two sides for their war aims. Woodrow Wilson presents a set of his own, and many of those war aims will find their way into the final peace settlement. And then the U.S. is in. And so we said initially the U.S. isn't ready for war, and so they're just contributing manufactured goods. Eventually they'll send some soldiers, but it'll really be at the tail end of the war where not many American soldiers will see. Okay. Thank you, Aishi. I didn't have my microphone turned on. You should be able to hear me now, at least I think. So if you're online and my microphone wasn't turned on, here we're talking about the Paris Peace Conference. So at the end of World War I, there's an armistice signed November 18th to November 11th, 1918, and then early in 1919, everyone sits around the table to hammer out a peace agreement. Of course, except for Germany, who, maybe their invitation got lost in the mail somewhere, or it went into their spam folder, who knows. Either way, they're not there. Russia's not there as well because, as you read in the textbook, Russia had left the war early, right? And so Russia negotiated a separate treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. It wasn't a very good deal for Russia, but it got them out of the war. But we'll deal with Russia a little bit later. So all the sort of major countries involved in World War I are there. Canada is there, and we got our own seat. We didn't have to sit at the kids' table, which was kind of nice for us, because as a country we were very much still at the kids' table. But as a bit of an aside, World War I was big for Canada. The Canadian soldiers had a pretty significant role to play in a lot of the major battles of World War I. And in the process, Canadians started to sort of see themselves as distinct and separate from the British Empire. Prior to World War I, a lot of Canadians British Canadians anyway, felt that they were just British people living in Canada, right? That's how they looked upon themselves. But after World War I, Canadians started to develop their own identity. They started to identify themselves not as, British citizens living in Canada, but as actual Canadians. And Canada's contribution to the war effort at places like, it may have come up in the textbook already, places like Vimy Ridge and Passchendaele and the Somme, and all of those battles kind of put the spotlight on Canada. And so coming out of this war, we kind of gained some international status as well. People actually see us as a separate, distinct country, not just one of Britain's colonies. And so we kind of don't have a ton of time to deal with it in this course, but this is actually a big war for Canada because it kind of starts to form a real Canadian identity, and people actually start to see us as a legitimate country, not just a colony of Britain. But anyway, we're there. We're not at the kids' table where we have a seat at the table, but really most of this treaty is going to be hammered out by David Lloyd George from the UK or from Britain, George Clemenceau from France, and Woodrow Wilson from the US. Orlando Vittorio is going to be there Vittorio Orlando, I'm sorry. Vittorio Orlando is going to be there for a short time from Italy. After a while, though, Vittorio is going to feel that Italy is not getting what was promised to it, and he's going to sort of go home angry in a bit of a tantrum. So most of the treaty is going to be hammered out by those three guys. And here, and so here they are. And so from left to right, that's David Lloyd George on the left. Vittorio Orlando is there talking to him, pointing a finger at him, kind of like, oh, you rascal, you, right? The guy with the big walrus mustache is George Clemenceau from France. Oh, hello. I remember you. Hello, Clarissa. It's nice to see you, even though I can't see you, but I'm glad you're here.
Nice to hear from you.
Huh?
It's nice to hear from you.
It's nice to hear from her, yes. And then, the guy on the far right is Woodrow Wilson. So here they are. What's that? He's very tall. Yeah, he's taller than the other guys for sure, right? I'm not sure how tall he was, but yeah, he looks like a tall guy. So these three guys here, George Clemenceau from France and Woodrow Wilson from the U.S. and David Lloyd George from Great Britain, they all had kind of different approaches to this treaty. They all had different things that they wanted to come out of it. And so for France's part, George Clemenceau wanted a treaty that would punish Germany. Okay, so he and many of his French countrymen felt that they were kind of sucker punched, right? Remember, what was the Schlieffen Plan again? Right, so Germany knew they were going to have to fight on two fronts, and so the plan was to knock France out of the fight really quick and then go and deal with Russia. And so if you remember, France wasn't part of this, right? Because it was between Serbia and Austria-Hungary over the Franz Ferdinand thing, and then it was Russia backing up Serbia, and then it was Germany backing up Austria-Hungary, and then the next thing you know, France has German armies rolling in. And so France got a little bit of, they got sucker punched on this one. And so they're
French like part of that alliance they have with the Serbians?
they were definitely connected in, but they weren't part of that kind of original conflict. And so either way, whether it's justified or not, the French were not happy with the fact that they were attacked by Germany. And so they wanted to punish Germany. They wanted Germany to pay. And so the French were advocating for a weakened Germany, a demilitarized Germany. Some people were even arguing that Germany should be broken up into separate states, the way that it originally was prior to 1870. The French wanted reparations. They wanted money from Germany to pay for all of the war damage. And to some degree that was warranted because keep in mind most of the fighting didn't actually happen in Germany. So Germany kind of spread out and fought the war for the most part on foreign soil. And so big sections of France are destroyed. I've got some pictures for you, destroyed as a consequence of the war. But Germany is kind of intact. And so the French are upset and they want to punish Germany pretty badly in this treaty. David Lloyd George has a bit of a different approach to this. So in terms of the words coming out of his mouth, he says that Germany should be punished as well. And in part that has to do with the mood of the British public. And so the British have been involved in this war for 4 years. They've lost hundreds of thousands of young men in this war. And so they want to punish Germany as well. And so those are kind of the noises that David Lloyd George is making as well, right? So, you know, all of Britain is upset and wants to punish Germany. And the Prime Minister is like, yeah, punish Germany. Let's get them, kind of thing. But privately, that's not what he's thinking, right? So he's a little concerned that a treaty that punishes Germany is going to make things worse rather than better. And as I pointed out here, he also fears Bolshevism. So Russia has just had a communist revolution in 1917. And so David Lloyd George is worried that if Germany is economically weak, that it will be a very fertile place for another Bolshevik revolution to happen. And so David Lloyd George is kind of, you know, chanting, you know, make Germany pay, make Germany pay. But privately, he's thinking, I'm not sure that's such a good idea. Okay. What's that?
Yeah, they were demanding to, pay for the damage.
Yeah. And then there's President Wilson. And so we kind of know what Woodrow Wilson wants already because he very clearly outlined his 14 points. So we kind of know where he's coming from. But he wants a just peace. So he doesn't want any sort of punishment or sort of punitive measures. He wants to sort of redraw the map of Europe in a way that this sort of conflict won't happen again, right? And so, again, he creates these 14 points. He outlines them to Congress, so to the House of Representatives. And then when he goes to the Treaty of Versailles here, Versailles, of course, is just outside Paris. When he goes to these meetings, he kind of takes those points with him and tries to work them into the treaty. And for the most part, he's pretty successful. He gets most of those things. In. So they work on it for a number of months, and then finally, in June 28th, they sign the Treaty of Versailles, which is the official ending of World War I. However, as I mentioned, Germany was not there, right? Their invitation went into the spam folder. Oops, they must have missed it. They didn't put it in their calendar. Or maybe they weren't invited, which they weren't. They weren't invited, and so Germany had a very different experience of this treaty than the other countries involved did, right? So Germany and France and Great Britain and the US, they sat down around the table, they argued with each other, they said, I want this, no, I want this, and they worked something out. But for Germany, they basically got the final product, right? And so this document got handed to them, and it was basically, here, sign this, or we're going to move our armies into Germany. Yeah, that was basically the statement. We will occupy Germany unless you sign this. And so Germany didn't really have a say in the negotiations, and they didn't really have a choice of whether or not to sign. And so their new government, which is called the Weimar Republic, so you'll remember you read that the German Kaiser abdicated and ran off to Holland and lived the rest of his life at a summer cottage or something like that. And they sort of reconstituted Germany under this kind of democratic republic centered in a place called Weimar. And so they call it the Weimar government or the Weimar Republic. And so these are the guys who are left to sign the peace treaty. But a lot of the German public was upset, right? So it's you can see it's known as this diktat, a dictated peace. So, yeah, we'll have peace, just sign here or we'll attack, right? And so, as you can imagine, Germany's not too happy with that. And one of the things they're particularly not happy with is this first thing here called the War Guilt Clause. And I have it. Where is it? Where is it? Oh, shoot. Oh, shoot, where is it? Where'd I put it? Hang on. Oh, there it is. This is it. This really stuck in Germany's, this really didn't sit well with Germany at all, right? So you can see here, the Allied and associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies. What do you think of that statement? Huh? What does this statement mean, first off?
Places all the blame on Germany.
For the countries who were supporting Germany.
It's all, yeah, but it's all Germany's fault, right? All of this destruction, all of this death, this is all your fault, Germany. How dare you, right? But is that reasonable? Is that true? Did Germany start all of this?
No, the Serbs started that.
They did not. Who did start all this?
Kind of the Serbs.
Kind of the Serbs. Yeah, so we had that assassination. Of course, it wasn't the Serbian government that started it. It was a terrorist organization. Still, the Serbian government did not cooperate with Austria-Hungary. But then is it Austria-Hungary's fault?
No. It was no one's fault.
I don't know. Germany backed them up, but Russia backed up Serbia.
They had alliances with them.
And France backed up Russia.
It's like everyone is,
The
kind of.
alliances is the what?
There's a lot of things happening, right? There are a lot of causal factors.
Why everyone is blaming Germany?
Everyone in this case blames Germany. And of course, they're not even at the table to defend themselves.
Just because Germany stood their ground longer than anyone else, and they were basically kicking the Allies around, so they were kind of pissed off.
They kind of were.
Revenge.
And we should probably point out at this point that according to Germany technically wasn't defeated in this war, right? So Germany, at the point where they signed the armistice at November 11th, Germany wasn't defeated. Triple Entente armies didn't move into Germany and take it. What happened was that the Kaiser abdicated and ran off, and the government that was left behind looked at their position, their ability to sort of continue to contribute resources to this war, and they said, you know what, I don't think we're going to be able to win this. And so Germany goes to the Triple Entente and says, okay, time out, let's talk about this. So they don't actually win, and they don't actually surrender. They just agree to a ceasefire, and then I guess hope that some sort of negotiation will come out of it. But they don't get invited to the negotiation. And then they get this thing where they're required to accept all responsibility for the war. And they don't even get to negotiate it because the thing gets negotiated in their absence and it just gets dropped on their desk and said, sign here. It's kind of a jerky thing to do, right? So in addition to some of the other things, there's this war guilt clause which points the finger at Germany and makes them take responsibility for the whole thing. They lose all of their overseas colonies. And so I know, where we're sitting now, colonialism is a bad thing and a destructive thing. But at the time, it was essential for Germany's economy and its ability to industrialize. And so for them to lose their colonies was a blow, right? They didn't have that many to begin with. We mentioned that the sort of scramble to grab colonies all around the world, Germany was a little late to that, and so they didn't really get a lot of colonies, and now they don't have any, right? They're stripped of them. They basically get the bill for this war, right? They have to pay reparations to the Triple Entente countries. And so this war cost, I think the textbook said 330 billion. And so Germany gets the bill for that. That's not a bill you want to open, right? For $330 billion. That's not a bill you want to open the envelope on.
They didn't pay them.
What's that?
They didn't pay.
Well, later. We're not there yet. But they got the bill for it, right? They had to give up land that they acquired. The size of their military was limited. A bunch of other things happened too, which I'll just mention quickly. The Polish state was created, so they did create a Poland out of this. These two provinces, Alsace-Lorraine, are given, I think it's just one province actually, given back to France. Germany loses its colonies and its territorial gains. And there's also these mandates. And so certain parts of the world are put under the control of the United Nations so that they can strengthen their governments and then eventually rule themselves. And so some of these colonies that belong to Germany, some of the ones that belong to the Ottoman Empire, they are put under the control of the United Nations in order that so that they can build a government structure and then rule themselves. Did I say United Nations? Okay, whoops, sorry. League of Nations. Yeah, so this is kind of the Europe that gets redrawn from World War II. And so, as you can see, a bunch of brand new countries are created, partially out of Germany, partially out of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, partly from the Ottoman Empire. And so there's a bunch of brand new countries here, right? Czechoslovakia is new. Austria and Hungary are different countries now. There's this new Yugoslavia thing, which has just been invented. What's that? Poland is brand new, right? Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, those are brand new. Finland gets carved out. So all these new countries come out of... Huh? Who names them? I assume that they're named within the Treaty of Versailles, but I don't know for sure. Czechoslovakia is named after the two groups that are in there, Czechs and Slovaks, right? Yugoslavia is, I think that's the, Yug is the Slavic or Russian word for south. And so it's kind of South Slavia. And so a place where Slavic people live in the south, maybe. I don't know who actually names them. I think the names make some sort of sense. But yeah, the map is pretty significantly redrawn, right? But immediately I'll point out the fact that it's a bit of a failure already, because the idea was to redraw the map according to lines of nationalism, right? To put a bunch of people who had a common language or ethnicity or culture and history and put them all in the same place so that they could rule themselves, right? That's kind of what nationalism was. But here you see that, well, we have Czechoslovakia, which has different people living in there already, so they're kind of stuck in the same country with each other. Same thing with Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia has a bunch of different religious and ethnic groups within it. Spoiler alert, that country won't last either. It will come apart because it's... Huh? Just at the bottom there, in the gray. Yeah, and so some of these countries will not last because, again, they're not well created in the first place. And so they contain groups of people that don't necessarily want to be in a country with each other. With Poland, there's still a ton of German people living in Poland. And so the map redraw is a bit of a failure. It's a bit of a mess, but we'll deal with that later too. Germany's going to lose some territory here. There's a lot of information on this slide that we probably don't need to know, but you can see Alsace-Lorraine there on the bottom left, that's going to go back to France. This green area, the Saar, is an area that's very rich in coal, so it's very good for making money, but it's going to be taken from Germany and it's going to be given to, or no, it's going to remain with Germany, but Germany has to give the coal to France, I think. So they're not going to be able to make any money off that.
Is that the Rhineland?
The Rhineland is the green. So the green is the area around the Rhine River. So that area is going to be demilitarized, so there's no weapons in there, and it's basically under the oversight of the League of Nations as well. Germany's going to lose that black area to Poland, the black area in the, on the right. They're going to lose that to Poland as well. And so Germany's going to lose a lot of things, right? They're going to lose land, they're going to lose people, they're going to lose access to resources, they're going to lose colonies, they're going to get a big bill for the war, they're going to get a finger pointed at them saying, oh, by the way, this is all your fault, Germany, how dare you start a war. They had to limit their military, they had to give up any navy that they had. They were supposed to turn over their ships to Britain, but they sunk them instead as a bit of a middle finger to Britain, rather than give them those ships. They just sunk them. And Germany has to pay $6.6 billion in gold and goods as reparations.
Did it fade eventually?
What's that?
Eventually, did it fade?
They did not.
No, the old Germans.
They did not. Okay, so this is kind of the treaty in its basic form. I downloaded the PDF of the treaty. It's very, very long, but that's the very short summary of it. So the treaty is signed. What's that?
There were made four treaties, right? The treaty of this treaty like this four, right?
There's four what?
You know, four treaty of things you have to follow.
No. What? I don't understand.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, yeah, so there's one treaty, and at the end of the negotiations, everyone signs it. So all of the countries that are there sign it. Germany eventually signs it, although they don't have much of a choice. And then it basically has to go, for the Americans and for the Canadians too, it has to go back to Congress to authorize it. And so Woodrow Wilson brings back the Treaty of Versailles and gives it to Congress and says, here, sign, this is what we negotiated, sign this. But very sadly, even though I think we could all agree that Woodrow Wilson's ideas were pretty reasonable and probably better for the good of the global order, Congress doesn't like it, and so they don't sign it. So even though the U.S. negotiated a pretty significant part of the Treaty of Versailles, and I think a lot of the ideas that got in there were pretty good, Congress doesn't sign it. And so the U.S. is forced to kind of sign their own peace treaty with Germany later, because this actually doesn't apply to them. And similarly, the U.S. doesn't join the League of Nations. So this is like President Woodrow Wilson's dream to create this association of nations that will look after collective security, and he gets it done, but then the U.S. votes not to join it. So that's a bummer, right?
Did they get a vote as a whole in the League of Nations?
I'm not sure. They wind up not being a member state. I'm not sure what their relationship then is after.
The thing that I've heard was that, the victors, they all kind of got a vote. And like everyone kind of got a vote, but Germany was like, no, we're not.
I know that we'll get into that. We'll get into the voting thing, because there is something to be said about the League of Nations, and it's probably worth knowing the things that it tries to do prior to World War II and the things that it actually fails in doing and why. So That's probably part of that story, but maybe we'll put a pin in that and come back to it when we talk about the, spoiler alert, failure of the League of Nations. Even though it was just created, we already know it's a failure. Ugh, man, history is sad sometimes. The Germans. The German response was downright angry, right? So again, they were hoping for something more in line with Wilson's 14 points, but what they got, as I say, was they had a peace agreement dictated to them. They had to sign it. They didn't get to negotiate it. They didn't like being made responsible for the entire thing, and they definitely didn't want to pay these huge reparations. And as we'll talk about tomorrow, they weren't really in the place to pay for anything. None of these countries were, because they had been basically spending all their money and resources for 4 years trying to win the war. And now nobody has any money. Everyone is broke at the end of this war. And so to ask one country, to ask Germany to come up with billions of dollars in payments is just not reasonable. Nobody has any cash. But the Germans are angry, and so here's a little primary source for you. So this, as you can see, this runs in a German newspaper the day of the signing, the day that the Treaty of Versailles is signed in just outside of Paris. This runs in a German newspaper. Today in the Hall of Mirrors, the disgraceful treaty is being signed. Do not forget it. The German people will regain their place amongst the nations to which they are entitled. Then will come vengeance for the shame of 1919. Well, there we go. Peace treaty concluded. This war will never happen again. Good job, everybody. Right? This is the day it's signed, right? So the day it's signed, Germany is already pretty clearly upset, right? And many people, Germans not only were they upset with other countries, with the people who had designed the Treaty of Versailles, but they were actually upset with their own government, with the Weimar government, because they felt that the government had stabbed them in the back, right? That the government had just let, the Allied powers write their own peace treaty, and the German government had signed it cowardly without any sort of pushback, and had, they'd stabbed Germany in the back. They'd screwed everybody over by doing this. I probably won't read this whole thing, but the summary is that the Germans didn't actually feel that they lost the war. And from their perspective, they didn't, right? The Germans were fighting, right? They were shooting at the French one day, and then the German government said, hey, time out, let's talk about this thing. And the German soldiers picked up their guns and they walked home, right? Germany wasn't occupied by foreign armies. Nothing, right? They just said, okay, let's stop fighting, let's talk about this. And so in a very kind of real way, Germany did not lose this war, but they definitely lost the peace, right? They lost the peace part of it because they wound up with an awful, awful deal coming out of the Treaty of Versailles. And yeah, if you know anything about 20th century history, you know that this is going to be a problem later on, right? Yeah, basically. Okay, so we only have a couple of minutes left. Before you pack up, I'm going to say goodbye to the people online. People online, thank you for participating today. That was good. Thank you, and we'll see you tomorrow. So I'm going to wave bye and say goodbye to you.